Good afternoon and welcome to our poetry workshop. This workshop will be ahead of next month, April, which is National Poetry Month. Of course, we all remember that during this time in April, McDermott Library usually has the haiku contest with lots of nice prizes for the winning haiku. But before we get to April, I wanted to introduce some of the really great resources for finding poetry at McDermott Library. But before we get to that, I'm going to introduce my colleague, Ryan. He will share his screen and then read a passage from a poem he has selected. Welcome, Ryan.
Howdy. Let me just go ahead and share my screen now. 1 second, please. Okay, do you see my screen now?
Yes, I see your poem.
Awesome. So I've chosen Because I Could Not Stop the Death by Emily Dickinson. It's one of my favorite poems. And after reading this first time, it's one of the few poems I actually remember. So let's go ahead and get started. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his ability. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the rain. We passed the fields of geese and grain. We passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer, my gown, my tippet only told. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day. I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity.
Wow, very good. Thanks, Ryan. Now I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that I can introduce you to some of the really great resources at McDermott Library. So let me see. All right, so this is the McDermott Library's website, and I'm going to demonstrate just a few of the resources and some of the ways that you can search for poetry, poets, and of course, one of the best kind of literature, narrative poems. First, I'm going to demonstrate databases. So of course, we know that we can get to databases by subject, and here we would click on arts and humanities, and then go to that web page. So here we can see there are several different kinds of resources on the arts and humanities subject selection under databases. There are lots of different kinds of ways to take a look at what the library would offer to do research on poems, poets, and of course, literature. So I'm going to scroll back up and show you another way to find poetry resources. So if we were to click back to the library's website, we can also click databases again. This time we would click all, since we probably wouldn't want to select anything or even know which one to select. Here, we could type in the filter to the extreme right. We would do poetry, click go, and here we would see that there's a whole different set of results. We have 20th century poetry, Latino literature, poetry, drama, and fiction. Of course, there would be the humanities full text. And as we continue to scroll down, we would see the Loeb Classical Library. And here, there will be epics and, of course, lyric poetry. And Latin American women writers would also give us a taste of finding poetry and poets specific to Latin America. So back up to the top again, and we'll go back to the library's website. And this time, instead of selecting under databases, we'll show you how to go with Discover. And of course, Discover, we can use keywords, we can use authors, we can use a variety of different kinds of resources to find what we're looking for under poets, poetry, and so on. So before I do that, I'm going to share one of my favorite poems. And this one is from Langston Hughes. It's called Harlem. And the title for A Raisin in the Sun, the play by Loreen Henry, comes from a part of this poem. So it goes like this. Harlem by Langston Hughes. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? So that's Harlem by Langston Hughes. So to continue, we're going to explore using Discover to find poets, poetry, literary criticism about poets and poems, and so on. So to begin, I'm going to go ahead and do poetry as my keyword, and I'm going to take a look at one of my favorite poets, and this will be Garcia Lorca. That's all I would have to type. I'm looking for his poetry, and I use the author's last name. In this way, I can tailor to exactly what I want. And I selected this one because I wanted to demonstrate that some of the library's content will be in other languages. So for example, this first result will be all in Spanish, but of course there will be a mix of languages that are also in the result. If we scroll down, we can go all the way down to language. And in this case, this is going to be in Portuguese, French, German, several other languages will be available. And there's the Spanish entry here, which is what that first result was demonstrating to us. So Garcia Lorca was one of those really intrepid, very descriptive, very interesting poets of another century. So here I would find that I can look at articles, book chapters, books. I could look at his books of poetry and other results that are available. I could also see that there are going to be lots of entries for literary criticism about his works, biographical material, and of course, the books of his poems and translations of his works. If I wanted to find out specifically something, I could also just limit to that result so that I can find exactly what I'm looking for. So if I wanted just to look at some of the material that would be available for doing, say, an assignment on Garcia Lorca and I just wanted to look at articles, I could delete the book selection. Then I would go to articles, and here I would get results that are all articles, literary criticism, historical criticism, and so on about Lorca's works. So again, that was fairly simple and straightforward: poetry, Garcia Lorca, and then we got our results, and we can select on the left column looking for specific information about the poet. The next thing we could do is look for other material that would be of interest. So narrative poems are often assigned to students to write criticisms or essays or assignments on. Some of the better known narrative poems, we all think of Beowulf. That comes to mind when we're going to do narrative poetry. So here, instead of just leaving it at articles, books, and more, I could check library catalog as my selection, and the results will show me the books that will be the narrative poetry, the book of the narrative poetry, and also we would see that we will get some results that are going to be books about the literary criticism, the historical information about this particular narrative poem. Again, we get our selections on the left column. We can look at books, audiobooks, lots of different selections. We can see available in the library, available online. We now have an entry for open access. So if we clicked that, we could see materials that are available online, either in open access or freely available on the web. So we can click the available online to navigate to that particular resource. So we'll get rid of the open access and continue through looking at Beowulf. Again, we can scroll to see specific information. Here we would look at subject topics for this. We can also see that there would be epic poetry in English, Old English. We can continue scrolling. We can see that there are different locations for this particular kind of work, even juvenile literature based on Beowulf. So again, that was looking for something specific instead of putting in keywords or an author. So the next thing we could do, if we did want narrative poems and we didn't know any titles or nothing came to mind, we could then type in the type of poetry. So here we would again do narrative poems. Lots of different suggestions are coming for us here below the selections. So we see that we can look at C.S. Lewis, we can look at Longfellow, female characters, that would be literary criticism. And we could also look at electronic resources. So I'm going to just go ahead and click the search icon so that we can get to a result list. So here we see that there are books that will be about narrative poetry. If we wanted to go more specific, we can go with books. We can look at collections. We can scroll down to see the types of books that are available under subject. So we can see that there's narration, rhetoric, there's poetry. So we can click poetry to add to our narrative poems topic. So here we see that there will be books that are highlighting narrative poetry, and we can also go back to the resource type and click books. And again, we can scroll down to see the types of availability, the selections available, where they're located. Main stacks would be the main stacks on the 3rd or 4th floor. New books are on the 2nd floor. Locations we can't typically get to at the moment with the library closed. And then we can get mixed in here. There would be several books that have narrative poetry in them. The Two Ivans is one type of those. And as we scroll, we can see more selections that are available. So again, we were looking for narrative poems. We looked at poetry, books. We can go back to the full selection by clicking the X on any of those selections. And that brings us back to our results list. So this was a brief overview of looking for poems, poetry, and poets in the library catalog on the library's website. We looked at databases and we searched through Discover just to see different kinds of poems that will give us some inspiration for coming up with haikus for National Poetry Month in April. So I guess if there are no questions, thank you all for joining, and I hope you enjoyed our brief workshop on poems, poetry, and poets. Thank you.